God who knoweth us to be set in the midst of so many and great dangers, that by reason of the frailty of our nature we cannot always stand upright, grant to us such strength and protection as may support us in all dangers and carry us through all temptations, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Well, we're in volume 3 of Canon Dixon's Methodistic treatment of the Church of England, shines through at points. Page 41, and we're in the midst of the Prayer Book Revision, 1549. Inquiries were to be extended through the whole range of heretical pravity. The seat of error and false doctrine was to be eradicated by their labors, rather by the salutary and condign penances which they should prescribe to the penitent, or by the final punishment of the obstinate according to the secular power. They might proceed by the most arbitrary processes known in ecclesiastical law, and 3 of them were sufficient, provided that one of the 3 were a bishop, or a more reckless edict was never issued. But it happily happened that the activity of this commission, composed so largely of clergy, was not in proportion to their plenary powers. We have seen that hundreds of presentments were made before the citizens who sat in Guildhall and Mercer's Chapel under the 6 Articles, for the commission which sat at Lambeth and in the Lady Chapel of St. Paul's. Only a few persons in this year at least are known to have been presented, of whom the most conspicuous was Michael Thombe, a butcher, who abjured, and Joan Bocher, or Joan of Kent, an unhappy creature who continued obstinate and was committed to prison in the vain but merciful hope that she might be claimed. The words which she addressed to the commissioners Cranmer, Smith, Cook, Latimer, Lyle, who reluctantly condemned her, seemed to indicate how futile the expectation that her curious in view of the incarnation might be changed. It is a goodly matter to consider your ignorance. It was not long since you burned and asked you for a piece of bread, and yet came yourselves soon after to believe and profess the same doctrine for which you burned her. And now, forsooth, you will needs burn me for a piece of flesh. And in the end, you'll come to believe this also when you've read the scriptures and understand them. Bocher had been in former times a vendor of Tyndale's Testaments and other prohibited books, which she conveyed under her clothes for the use of the advanced ladies at the court, with whom and Askew she maintained an acquaintance. The new prayer book appeared to be the signal of a religious war. In the hour when it was first used, 5 or 6 counties rose in arms. In the west there were great uprisings, and in Oxfordshire, Berkshire, and Norfolk. Even the subjugated Yorkshire was not unstirred. But the consent of contemporary authorities makes it clear that it was only the first of these outbreaks that was caused by zeal for the old religion, and that in assigning the motives of other insurrections, regard must be had to various impulses that swayed the time. In the West, indeed, in the country of the Poles and the Montagues, the ancient faith was strong, and it was when the act of uniformity inured and the accustomed order of divine service was altered by the new book. It was when they found themselves exposed to a new visitation, with the abrogation of nearly all the ceremonies of their churches, that the men of Devonshire and Cornwall flew to arms. Then it was that a real war, unlike the pageant of the pilgrimage of grace, spread itself over a large part of the country and occupied the summer. This would be 1549. after Whitsunday, and although the religious war of England cannot be compared with the terrible convulsions of the continent, which took place in the same age, yet it was maintained on the part of those who woke it with a valor and persistence which was worthy of the English name. But the disturbances of other parts of the country were not of this character. Some of them began and ended before the Western risings. Others, though contemporaneous with the Western risings, were avowedly unconnected with them and even of an opposite origin. They proceeded in the main out of the exasperation of the people under the excesses of bad government, and immediately out of the frustration of their hopes in the late Parliament. The people found their petitions against the enclosure of land unheard. The bills which the patriot Hales had drafted thereon had been quashed, and the measuring lines of the rich were daily stretching over hill and dale, severing innumerable acres from the common fund. Instead of the redress of such injuries, they saw a new prodigious tax laid on the realm by the legislature. The fifth of all property, it was exclaimed, had been granted to the king. And at the time they discerned, or thought that they had discerned, in the dissensions, the weakness of their oppressors. These, not religion, were the causes of the sporadic outbreaks which ranged over the center of the country, though it cannot be denied in one case, in the Oxfordshire commotions, the old religion had a share. In other cases, if religion entered into the dispute, it was in the shape of the inconvenient fanaticism of the Anabaptists and other froward children of the Reformation itself. It seems probable that even in the beginning, the year the remonstrances of the commoners of England took the form of popular assemblies or tumults, which were pacified with ease and lenity by Somerset and his fellows, although the continued encroachments of the left unremoved the most substantial grievance. But when religious alteration, enforced in prayers and rites, was added to the miseries of the age, then a part of England rose in resistance so formidable as to threaten for a moment the prosperity of the Reformation. The ancient faith sprang high even as the death wound reached her heart. In the history of the struggle, which is now related perhaps for the first time in fullness, we shall call upon to observe equally the valor of English peasantry, the skillful campaign by which the triumph of the Reformation and of uniformity was secured, and the severity with which the majesty of the legal revolution was vindicated. Nor less will it be necessary to admire the exactness with which the arts and arms of the same revolution were turned against the enemies of the public peace, who disparked parks and pulled down enclosures, but did those deeds in the name of the English Reformation itself and to the sound of the English litany. In the course of an eventful summer, we shall be transported from the fastness of Dartmoor or the walls of Exeter to the wild tribunal of Mousehold Hill and the towers of Norwich. The service book was used throughout England for the first time on Whitsunday, the 9th of June. On Whitsunday, the parish priest of Sampford Courtney, a village of Dartmoor in Devon, 16 miles west of Exeter, was going into his church for morning prayers when a group of parishioners, among them a tailor named Underhill, and Hager, a laborer, came about him asking what he meant to do and what service he would say. That he would say the same service that he had said the day before, according to the law set forth, was the answer of the priest. But the villagers reply, "We will keep the old and ancient religion, as our forefathers before us have done, As King Henry VIII, by his last will and testament, took order that no alteration should be made until King Edward, his son, was come into full age. He's but a child and can do nothing. We also will not have any change. The priest yielded, put on the vestments, said Mass in the old language with all the customary ceremonies. The news was carried in an instant through the whole country, the people everywhere clapping their hands for joy and determining to have the same in their parishes. 4 of the nearest justices who came on the following day to investigate the matter found the village of Sampford in a threatening posture. When they reached the place required to confer with the people, they were bidden to leave all their men behind and come alone into a close not far off. From timidity or being like affected, the magistrates complied, though their men were the greater number and sufficient to have repressed the movement on the spot. The conference was held, but nothing was decided, and the magistrates departed. The exulting commoners spread their triumph far and wide. The commotion rolled westward and was augmented by a rising in the neighboring county of Cornwall, where the severities exercised the year before by the royal visitation had left a feeling of irritation, which had grown greater through the unabated activity with which the commissioners were still pursuing the investigation of the goods of the churches. This dangerous moment the divisions of the council concealed if they diminished its real strength. On every point of policy there was disagreement between the Lord Protector and the rest. The French war was impending, for Somerset had abandoned the project which he entertained of settling the French difficulties by selling Boulogne for a sum of money and ending at the same time the lingering feud with Scotland. If this policy had prevailed, it was not impossible that England, in alliance with France, might have stood at last in the character of the defender of the Protestants against the irresistible power of the Emperor. But that wide and illusory prospect commended not itself to the body of the council. They preferred a line of action which would enable them to draw foreign soldiers into England instead of sending English soldiers to foreign wars. The anger of France was disregarded, and the Scottish ulcer was kept open, while strong defensive measures were secretly taken against any danger that might arise nearer home. The public service in every department was in disorder. Peculation on every hand emptied the public purse. Piracy had well nigh swept commerce from the seas. The credit of England had never stood so low. But on the point of self-defense, the ruling faction had tacitly gathered all their strength. The public purse was empty. Their private purses were full and might be opened in case of need. The public purse itself was replenished for the time by loans obtained at a high rate from the Flemish Jews, the interest of which was shamelessly paid in lead and bell metal from the churches and chantries. The Scottish War afforded a pretext for reorganizing the army. Above all, the force of foreign mercenaries was largely increased. The English service was in bad repute among the hireling soldiery of Europe, the pay being said to be uncertain and the danger great, but even this fell to the account of the council. As the Lagenecks and arquebusiers refused to serve unless it were in such numbers as might ensure good treatment, they were hired in large bodies, and the annals of the Privy Council for his year are filled with the names of Italian, Spanish, German, and Flemish captains, the leaders of bands of trained fighting men, armed with weapons against which the bills, bows, and matchclocks of the English peasantry were almost useless. who received the pay of the government of England. Many of these bravos were sent northwards into the Scottish War, whence they would be easily recalled in case of need. A considerable force, 10,000 infantry and 500 cavalry, were engaged for the defense of Boulogne. 4,000 German horse lay at Calais. Other bands, numbering 2,000 or 3,000, were reserved in and about London to compose the agitations of England itself. And it is a thing to be held in eternal memory that the English Reformation at this great crisis was carried by the aid of foreign cutthroats who, on their return to their own countries, sought absolution for the sin of fighting for heresy. Meanwhile, Somerset continued to display the contradictory qualities of an aristocratic demagogue, to which he seems to have added an attempted imitation of the temper of Henry VIII. The distressed people heard promises from his lips. He directed against their rich oppressors menaces and exhortations, but his promises were barren of good. His monitions were based on nothing. His partners in the revolution were exasperated by a high demeanor, for which his virtue gave no warrant, and they failed to understand why a man who pillaged and desecrated with as little scruple as they themselves should have. They could not rely on him. They felt him to be destitute of that instinct for the common cause which might have covered an arrogance that was outrageous and a violence that was without discrimination. His friend Paget seemed to warn him of the danger of his conduct, but in vain. At the beginning of May, he sent an urgent letter on his habit of giving offense. Unless, he said, you more quietly show your pleasure in things wherein you debate with other men and hear them more graciously, no man will dare to speak to you. You hear me speak gently and graciously in the council, and I speak more liberally than others. But you use me so sharply sometimes that if I were not assured of your favor, I might often be blanked for speaking frankly. Now, if you snap other honest men, having occasion by your own appointment to say their opinions, I know not what loss or danger you shall have by it. Of late you are grown into a great choleric fashion whenever you are contraried. That was the fashion of the king that dead is, and it near cost him his life. A worthy knight whom you had rebuked sorely beyond what was needed came to my chamber this afternoon weeping, and nigh out of his wits and heart. By the living God, if I knew not how much men of service be troubled withal, I would not write thus much. Remember the words spoken by the Lord, Protector, go to a man's heart. But the intolerable carriage, and therewith the unmeaning plausibility and weakness, the Protector remained unchecked. And throughout the months of the great risings, we may remark, on the one hand, the false and dangerous leniency of the head, on the other, the resolute ruthlessness of the body of the council. Rivers of feeble expostulations and proclamations proceeded from Somerset. From the others came prompt and decisive action. To Russell, Grey of Wilton, Herbert, Paulet, and Speke, the magnitude of the danger close at hand was as visible as it was to Paget at the distance of the Emperor's court. Russell, who was having the most to lose in the West, was the most sensitive and active of all, rushed forth at once into the disaffected region, trusting to raise men by his own influence sufficient to make head against the rebels. Herbert, one of those whose parks had been attacked, hurried to the Welsh border to bring up a foreign force that lay there, and in necessity succor Russell by moving through Somersetshire. Grey of Wilton, with the body of mercenaries, marched through the center of England, crushing whatever resistance was made when he appeared, and and able to strike irresistible blows either to the left or to the right. Under the influence of Somerset, gentleness was attempted at first. On the news of the Western insurrection, 2 gentlemen of Devon, Sir Peter and Sir Gawain Carews, were at the court, were ordered to proceed to Exeter to endeavor to pacify the country, to cause the people to disperse quietly, and refer their complaints to the king and council. But this gentle commission was accompanied by others, of which the Lord Protector knew nothing, to put down the rebellion with a strong hand, and thus the emissaries of peace went forth with the wings of war. On their arrival in Exeter, the Carews were informed that the men of Sampford and their confederates had advanced to the little town of Crediton, 7 miles distant, a venerable place, the ancient seat of a bishopric. This they had fortified, cutting trenches across the highways, raising up a rampire of earth at the further end of the town, and piercing the walls of a row of barns with loopholes for shot. After consultation with the justices at Exeter, the Carews rode out to Crediton with all the horsemen that they could collect and attempted to open a conference with the rebels. This being refused, they attacked the rampire, but found it stoutly manned, and a galling fire opened on them from the barns along the road. They drew off with some loss, and the insurgents seemed to have carried the day, when a serving man of one of the justices set one of the barns on fire. Those who were within ran out, spreading a panic through the rest. The rampire was destroyed, the defenders flying to a further point, but more indignation and alarm was caused by the encounter. The cry was raised everywhere that the gentlemen were destroying the commoners, and the barns of Crediton became the watchword of insurrection. A few days after this, another outbreak occurred closer to Exeter. A gentleman of Budleigh Salterton, Walter Raleigh, the future father of the celebrated son, riding into the city on a holiday, overtook an old woman telling her beads on the way to church of St. Mary Clist, a village belonging to Lord Russell, about 2 miles from the city. Raleigh roughly asked what she did with the beads. That religion was reformed. Now there were punishments for her and such as she, unless they obeyed the laws now put into force. The dame went on to church, where the parishioners were at service, and being impatient and in agony, she began to exclaim how she had been threatened by the gentlemen that unless they should give over their beads, holy bread, and holy water, the gentlemen would burn them in all their houses and spoil them. The villagers swarmed out of the church like a sort of wasps and rushed to their town, which they began to fortify. Part of them ran towards Exeter and overtook Raleigh, who was glad to escape into Thombe Chapel, whence he was rescued by some seafaring men from Exmouth. He afterwards fell into the hands of the rebels again and was in confinement to the end of the insurrection. The Carews, again, accompanied by the justices, rode out the next morning, which was Sunday, to pacify this new commotion. They found the bridge of St. Mary Clist barricaded and armed with cannon from the shipping in the river. Sir Peter dismounted and advanced alone toward the bridge, when one of the gunners leveled a piece of ordnance and would have discharged it if he had not been withheld by another man. A parley then ensued, and commoners consented to admit 3 of the justices, Pollard, Dennis, and Pard, within their defenses for further conference. It was 10 in the morning when they entered. The day wore away. The tide rose and fell in the river. Evening came, but they returned not. The party on the bank could hardly restrain their impatience. Some were for charging the bridge with the retainers of the absent Magistrates remonstrated against this, lest it should endanger the lives of their masters. Some began to try the depth of the water with their lances, if they might ride the river and enter the village by the side. They were warned to desist by menacing shouts from the opposite side. At length the envoys reappeared, briefly refusing to enter into particulars on the spot, took horse, and all rode back together to Exeter. At supper, for all supped together, they delivered their message. It was found to consist of the same terms that had already been proposed by the men of Sampford. The assembled commoners were willing to disperse and go no further, so that the king and his council would not alter the religion, but suffer it to remain and tarry in the same state as King Henry VIII left it, until the king himself came to his full age. Hereupon a grave silence followed, and then a warm altercation. Sir Peter Carew, who had perhaps acted as well as might be expected in an advocate of peace, having no force to compel peace, and hampered by contrary instructions, fiercely reproached the justices with slander and sinister dealing. But the commoners were felt to have made good their stand. The news of their bloodless victory flew through the country. Every village began to follow the lead of Crediton and St. Mary Clist. The roads were cut, trees were felled, rampires were piled, bridges were broken, and the commoners, augmented by the movement in Cornwall, rose to the number of an army. In Exeter, the alarm was so great that the word was given for everyone to shift for himself. Many gentlemen left the city by stealth and were captured outside. Many were taken in their own houses, not unwillingly, it was thought, and detained as prisoners. Others took to the woods to avoid capture. Carew himself escaped with difficulty and made his way to Russell, who'd reached Taunton, by whom he was ordered to report himself in London to the Lord Protector. The insurrection of the West was now confirmed. The insurgents numbered 10,000 men. They were no mere rabble, though but rudely armed. They were 10,000 stout and valiant personages, deliberately resolved to stand for the ancient religion, the ceremonies and usages of their ancestors, against the premature and interested alterations which went hand in hand with social ruin. The White Rose, doubtless, was among them, but only as a memory. The great nobles of the West, the Poles and the Montagues, had perished 10 years before on the scaffolds of Henry. The bitter recollection of their fall alone remained to animate the insurgents. Several gentlemen, indeed, put themselves at the head. Sir Thomas Pomeroy, Mr. Bury, Mr. Coffin, James and John Rosigan, and John Payne of Devon, Cornwall, Sir Humphrey Arundel, Mr. Winnislade, and Mr. Holmes, but none of these were of the first rank. Over themselves, the insurgents appointed captains of humble origin, Underhill and Hager, the tailor and the laborer of Sampford, Ponder, a shoemaker, Ashridge, a fish driver, and others of like occupations. There were many priests with them, a great multitude of priests, some of whom became governors of the camps. They seem to have attempted the organization of an army and to have maintained discipline, though they are said to have wasted the country for support. Their purpose was not aggressive. It was to repel religious innovation from their own country. They stood on their own soil. They entrenched themselves and remained a month without further movement. But to advance is the only safety of insurgents, and it was in an hour fatal to a cause already doomed, that this army of peasants formed the siege of the city, propitious to the Tudors, which had formerly baffled the assaults of Perkin Warbeck. Meanwhile, in several articles or sets of articles, all concerning religion, they sent their demands to the king and council. Let us have, they said, the general councils and the old decrees observed, the 6 articles of Henry revived, the Mass in Latin, celebrated by the priest alone, without others communicating, the sacrament hung over the altar and worshipped, and those who consent not thereunto to die like heretics, the sacrament delivered to the people only at Easter, and then only in one kind, holy bread and holy water, palms and ashes, images set up again, and all other ancient ceremonies, baptism administered at all times, as well as on weekdays as on holidays, souls in purgatory prayed for by name, our old service of matins, mass, even song and procession. We will not have them in service, nor the Bible in English. We will have Dr. Mormon, Dr. Crispin, and Cardinal Pole restored. We will that no gentleman have more than one servant for every 100 marks that he can dispend. We will that half of the abbey lands and chantry lands in every man's possession, however gotten, be restored and given to the maintenance of 2 chief places of religion in every county. We will have our children confirmed whenever we resort to the bishop. We will not have married priests. We will have God's service said or sung in the choir as heretofore, and not God's service set forth like a Christmas play. These demands, of which several sets, generally equivalent, appears to have been dispatched to several authorities, were answered variously by the king, or rather by the Lord Protector, and by the archbishops. Bishop, the answers issued in the name of the king were mild, argumentative expostulations, containing, however, some threats and intimating that the voice of mercy, mercy, and life might be changed to that of justice, justice, and death. The mildness of their tone was due to Somerset, who had already fanned the flame more widely by issuing a proclamation for the pardon of all offenders, of all rioters. And here we'll bring against the enclosures. This he followed by instructions addressed to Lord Russell, which seemed fitter to prevent a premeditated outbreak and to extinguish an actual insurrection. In the face of such weakness, it was vain. The archbishop, in his answer to the rebels, assumed a tone of menace beyond the others. And here we'll draw it to an end. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Ghost, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Godspeed.